Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and fanfare, please. Look who it is. It's regular contributor, Emilie Kornheiser. So glad you're here today.
Hi, Olga. I am so glad to be back here with you now.
The session is going to be done in about a week. How are you doing? Because I know this is kind of the hardest part of the session because things are going to live or not, and you haven't slept in probably 3 months, and you're tired of seeing the same people every day.
The session's going to end in a week, and it's certainly been very hard, and there's still a lot of decisions up in the air that need to be made. And I am involved in many of them for one reason or another. You know, it was feeling particularly hard, and then I ran into someone who was very involved in passing the child care bill last year, and they reminded me how incredibly difficult that was too. And I thought, oh, it's always like this.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, that's soothing somehow. Yeah. And, honestly, I have slept fairly well until this week. I've been trying to take care of myself, so I have the strength to do the job well. And I'm excited about a lot of what we've gotten done, and I'm excited to be here with you and to be rejoining the happy hour. For folks who maybe didn't hear the episode where I explained why I disappeared, in the sort of mix of the first month or two of the session, I was talking to so many reporters about various issues we were working on here, and I just got tired of my own voice. And I felt like happy hour listeners deserved more from me than sound bites, because this show has always been about showing up fully and having a really meaningful conversation with you, Olga. And so I didn't want to be here when I wasn't interested. And so I'm so glad to be back here with vim and vigor to talk about things and to not be tired of my own voice anymore. And
well, we're
it's
glad.
Great to see your face.
Yes, it's good for our radio listeners. Of course, Emilie and I haven't seen each other really in many, many weeks. Well, except we bumped into each other at Amy's. Yay, Amy's.
That was really nice, that moment. Yes.
That was. So let's dive into taxes, because, for folks who may not remember, Emilie's the chair of the Ways and Means Committees. So committee for the House. So it is all taxes all the time. And as we've said before, taxes are kind of the infrastructure of our priorities of what we're going to pay for. So talk to us a little bit. I think the last time you were on the show, we talked education taxes. There was also the surcharge, the 3% surcharge that we've talked about. Where would you like to start with all the pies you've had your fingers in?
I'm going to start sort of big picture of how we went into the session, if that's okay with you, Olga.
That would be great. Well, and before you dive in, I would say one reason, just to frame it, why I think it's great is I think taxes are one of those things we're told we have to pay, and we just sort of feel like we're victims to the taxes. And so the more people can understand how they operate and what's happening and the thought behind them, I just think that would be wonderful. So thank you, Emilie.
I would love that. So taxes are how we pay for civilization. They're how we contribute to civilization. There's a lot, certainly at the national level, things that our taxes pay for that I think we're all uncomfortable with in a million different directions. And there are lots of sort of rules that have been set up for that in a lot of different directions to ease people's comfort. But I know that feels very far away. And then at the municipal level, a lot of folks sort of watch the select board develop the budget and go to town meeting and debate the budget. And that's sort of like the core services. They're almost like the core services of a household, right? And the municipality only has like one way to really raise taxes for itself. I mean, there's like a couple more, but there's not a lot of nuance or ability to be sort of progressive in taxes on the municipal level. They have property taxes, and they're straightforward property taxes. It's just sort of like a percentage of your house value. And the state level, we're sort of like in between the two. We have a lot more tools at our disposal, right? We can tax a wider variety of things, raise revenue in a wider variety of ways, and we can add a lot more nuance to how we do it to make sure that folks who have more are paying more and folks who have less are paying less. And Vermont, and actually like most states around the country, are in a really interesting crux this year. And we knew that going into the session. So we were riding high on sort of pandemic era federal spending, right?
Right.
We had like all of those dollars that went directly to the state of Vermont. And we had all those dollars that went directly in people's pockets and we know that when like direct payments are made from government to Vermonters, they spend them. And so we also had revenue from that, like sales tax and meals and use tax and all those things, mostly sales tax.
And there was in general just more money churning in the economy.
Yeah, and when like more money is churning, like people are better off and government is better able to serve people. And so we had all that extra churn. And this was the first year that we didn't have that anymore. And a lot of the effects from the pandemic are still really with us. So let me talk you through a couple of those, because this is how we knew we were walking into the session. We knew we did not have all of the money that we thought we had, that we'd had in past years. We were really sort of coming down off this like big hilltop and not crashing, right? It's not like a ski race. It's not even a sled. It's just like we're sort of coming down off the hill and we're going to like, I don't really have the right geology terms for whatever happens, but we were sort of coming down off the hill and we're going to be on a new plateau than the one we were on before the pandemic. That's called rebasing, but it was certainly going to be less. But things are different than before the pandemic. And so there's a few of them that are really important to remember. One, the cost of lending has gone up a lot. So that makes it really much harder for businesses to borrow. It makes it really harder for people to buy homes. Bunch of things like that. And it makes sort of, in some ways, it can make it more expensive for government to do business too. Inflation, which has, there's sort of real inflation, and then there's the inflation that comes when businesses essentially take advantage of inflation to raise prices. And there's a lot of evidence, a lot of research that like a lot of the sort of like grocery store pocketbook inflation that we're saying is actually just price gouging by multinational corporations.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember the egg crisis.
Yes.
That's a really good example of that, but there are lots of smaller examples of that. So prices are up for everything. And corporations are reaping record profits from prices being up for everything.
Okay.
And then we have a few years of really, really hard times from essential workers, right? State employees, a lot of them still had to go to work every day, right? Like the correction staff still had to go to work every day through like really, it's hard to remember those early times of the pandemic where people were like, had no idea in what way they were risking their health. They knew they were risking their health. They didn't know how, right? Teachers still going to work every day through like unbelievably tumultuous situations, really traumatized kids, all of that. And so labor conditions on the other side of the pandemic have improved because everyone saw those folks go through so much. And so any organization that was really able to raise wages through that time raised wages. And government pays for a lot of those wages, right? Like schools, government employees, contractors, all of that. That's all like government spending that pays for those increased wages. And then we are in the middle of, and I don't like to use the word housing crisis, we are in a housing crisis in Vermont. And that we are not the only place having a housing crisis, but we are certainly really thick and deep in it.
We are feeling it. We're feeling it, yes.
And there are a few pieces of that really increase government spending and then also increase the need for government spending. So we have a whole lot of folks that have no home and can't find a home because there's absolutely no home to find.
Right.
And those folks are staying in motels that the state of Vermont is paying for. If Vermont stopped paying for that, those folks would not be staying in motels. They'd be sleeping, on the streets of Brattleboro. And we've seen what that looks like and how that impacts commerce of our town, feel of our town, and like the health and well-being of our neighbors, right?
Right. It
And
will still
then,
cost us money somehow also. We just may not see it in the same way we see the motel program.
yep, human suffering and lots of sort of like, stressors on our economy and our bottom line. And then, cost of housing also has gone up. The cost to build housing has gone up. Then the last one is, the pandemic caused or exacerbated a mental health crisis. And some of that's a loneliness crisis, some of that's a desperation crisis, some of that's a stress crisis. And a lot of that is a drug and alcohol crisis. And so our community that already has been wrestling with opioids for quite a long time, right? We remember when Shumlin made his announcement, we set up really comprehensive treatment facilities, all of that. And really right before the pandemic, we were coming out of it very slightly. And like talking to staff who had been working on this issue for a long time felt actually really hopeful that new folks were not getting addicted at the levels that we'd been seeing previously. However, the pandemic sort of really ended all of that. A lot of, sort of like entry-level jobs disappeared during the first years of the pandemic. People were much more socially isolated. I think our global stress levels have gone up. Our ability to connect with each other has gone up. I know that when we've had folks who were who were involved in opioids on the show before, people use the line like the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah.
And our chances for connection have really been stressed since the pandemic, and still, right? Still, I think we feel more disconnected from each other. So we have, a substance use crisis in Vermont as well. So we knew all those things going into January, right? Yes. And so what were we going to do about them? We knew that our general fund was going to need more resources just to maintain basic services. That's like, in order to meet the needs of the Pay Act, that's sort of the state employee pay that the governor negotiates with state employees, the Pay Act. We knew that that was likely going to go up significantly. We knew that teacher contracts were going up significantly. We knew that just like the cost of building and maintaining and everything, just like basic functioning of government was going up. And we knew that our needs were going up. So we might need new programs as well. And so in the context of all of that, we went into the session and we also went into the session. I went into the session knowing that economic inequality was up, right? And that people were struggling and some people were profiting. And so went into the session thinking, okay, we know we're going to need more resources, not just this year, but in future years, because we're coming down that hill of state revenues and income inequality is up. So what are we going to do about it in order to meet Vermonters' needs? And so that was some of the tax policy that I came into the session thinking about. I'll pause there and we can talk about schools, which are like sort of separate from all of this, but all really wrapped up in it too.
Okay. Thank you for that context, Emilie. And I think that's one thing folks sometimes forget in Vermont is that we have seen and we have experienced an increase in income inequality. And I have seen that from both sources within Vermont and national sources as well about an uptick. And I don't remember what the percentage is, but it has gone up. Before we dive into schools, you're talking about tax policy, and even though wages have gone up, when you compare us to our New England neighbors, we're still lagging behind. How do you balance that? When you're looking to build more revenue, and yet we know even with the 3% surcharge, there's still a lot of people with wages who could be really impacted by increased taxes. What are some thoughts around
that? Are you saying there are a lot of people that would be impacted by the 3% surcharge, or there are a lot of people?
No, okay. No. Just to me, it seems like a real math problem. How do we raise revenues when we are working with a population who maybe doesn't have a lot of extra revenues to be raised on?
Yes, exactly. So the 3% surcharge, which once it became sort of legislative reality, was in fact just a new tax bracket that was the equivalent of a 3% surcharge, but set up as sort of a new top tax bracket, which we had removed a top tax bracket under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act a number of years ago. We're sort of putting that back in. It's a new tax bracket for folks who make around $500,000 a year. It's a marginal tax rate, and that impacts 1% of tax filers, the top 1% of tax filers. And that was raising money to build new housing so that we aren't spending money on emergency housing anymore, and new housing so that like folks who are moving here for jobs can find housing, folks who live here can, downsize, shift their housing, all those things. And that passed the House. That's one strategy. Other strategies are Vermont's corporate tax structure is set up in a very interesting way that is sort of counterintuitive. And so I'm going to take a minute to explain it. And this is reforms that we did on Ways and Means last biennium. And they're pretty significant, but they haven't gotten a lot of conversation because they're super wonky. But that's what the happy hour is for.
That's what we do here. Cheers, by the way.
Cheers. So I think when most people think about corporate income taxes, if they do think about corporate income taxes, their first question is like, what's a corporation? And most think of corporations and businesses as the same thing. But in Vermont, most businesses are not actually incorporated as a corporation. They're incorporated as an LLC, as a partnership, as a single sole proprietor, as a nonprofit, all those things, right? A corporation has shareholders and all kinds of other things. We're talking about C3s. And I think most people might think that, you just pay taxes on your profits the same way you do with your income tax, because it's called a corporate income tax.
Right.
But how we figure those profits is actually very different from state to state. And in Vermont, because most corporations' profits don't just happen in one state the same way most people's income happens in one state, though not always.
Good point.
And so the way we figure out sort of how much of that corporation's income is attributable to Vermont can happen in different ways. Historically, and in many other states do this, it was used sort of this multi-factor approach. It was, how many people do you have working in Vermont? How much property do you own in Vermont? And then what are your sales in Vermont? And so as you might imagine, that means that sort of like the corporations that really are like hunkered down here and doing business here and contributing in other ways to communities here are bearing more of the burden, the responsibility of corporate taxes than a business that's just selling stuff into Vermont, and maybe even those inflationary prices, like say your Amazons of the world, right? We also have a system where only domestic profits were included in sort of that full picture. So if you think about all these bubbles and how much of the bubble was considered profit, it was just domestic profits. But what a lot of corporations do is they offshore those profits. And I think everyone's heard that term before, right?
Yeah.
And so in offshoring those profits, they are not considered sort of part of the package that gets attributed fractionally to Vermont. So a number of years ago, on the Ways and Means Committee, we did this last biennium, we changed to a single sales factor.
Okay.
And that means we decide how corporations' profits are taxed, attributing them to just the percentage of sales they had into Vermont. So say you're Amazon, it's domestic profits, however those are figured. And then what percentage of their total sales in the country are attributed to their sales into Vermont? That would probably be like 0.000001, right? And that's how they attribute what percentage of their profits would be taxable at the tax rate that Vermont sets.
Okay.
And so that's a big change we made. We also changed a few other things so that all of that shifting around of profits can't happen anymore. So you can't have 6 subsidiaries and only one subsidiary sells into Vermont and you move all of your profits into your other 5 subsidiaries. all of the different subsidiaries are considered a collective whole for the
Ah,
purposes of taxation. That was something we did last biennium. And then this biennium, we, knowing that we had done this great change, meant that Vermont corporations, Vermont-based corporations, are not often paying as much taxes as sort of corporations housed outside of Vermont that might just be doing business in Vermont.
oh, interesting.
Yeah. Are now, if they're just domestic corporations, they might be at a real disadvantage compared to global corporations that can offshore their profits. And so we want to make sure they have, real competition, like a competitive advantage. We're not giving global corporations a competitive advantage over domestic corporations.
Right.
Because we don't want people to be able to offshore their profits in order to create that. So we, one of the big proposals this year, in order to make sure that like Vermont services are paid for by those who can most afford it, and the burden isn't sitting on those of us who are already, scraping by, we removed an exemption for something called GILTI, which is global intangibles. It's one of the ways that profits are offshored.
Okay.
And so we made sure that like domestic corporations and global corporations are on a level playing field when it comes to doing business in Vermont, paying your taxes in Vermont. So that's another way we are able to sort of use a progressive tax structure to make sure that the services that Vermonters benefit from are paid for by those who can most afford it.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, thank you for walking us through that corporate structure because I think we often forget the corporate tax when we always go to the property and the education tax. I
Mhm.
just want to be kind of circle back to something and get clear talking about the I'll still call it the 3% surcharge for now.
Mhm.
Um, that originally came to you as a bill, I think is it H 850? It sounds like that is no longer a bill. It was just became an alteration in the tax structure to become a new tax bracket. Am I
Yes,
okay?
that is
So,
true. And it was not, it did not move sort of on its own. Generally, we don't just like pass taxes all by themselves. We make sure
right.
we're being clear with Vermonters and other legislators about why we're raising those taxes. And so we used that original bill, that original vehicle is what we call it, to talk about income inequality, to talk about who would be impacted from a tax like that, to talk about whether a bracket or a surcharge made sense. And then when a great big 10-year strategic plan housing bill came to us that needed revenue, we sort of took that piece of tax policy and put it on that bill to pay for a 10-year plan to really solve our housing crisis.
Fascinating. Thank you for walking us through that because right now if you go to the state's website where you can look up individual bills, I looked up that bill yesterday and I'm like, it's gone nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
But now we know why it actually has. It's just not in that form, whatever it was. I think it's H 850.
One of the funny things, we talk about bills being on the wall, and we've talked about that before on the show. And our wall in Ways and Means is like there's like these little paper cutouts that have the bills on them. That's on a bunch of bulletin boards. And because most of the bills that come through the building that go through any committee, come through Ways and Means, we have like a lot of them on our wall. And our committee assistant sort of has this whole system for the bills that did not pass, but got incorporated into other bills. So we're like, we know that this is law. It just didn't move on its own. But there's no system for that on the legislative website. It's just a system that we have like internally with paper inside our committee room.
Oh, that's fascinating. I imagine all these color coded index cards.
That's like sort of, I mean, they're not even as, they're just like printed out paper. So they're not even as firm as an index card, Olga.
So we have just like 4 minutes before the
Mhm.
break. So I don't think we can get into ed taxes right
Yeah.
now. But what is important for people to understand just based on what we've talked about now? How do you kind of want to wrap it up?
Well, the last tax that I would say is sort of part of what we were working on this year is a change to the property transfer tax. So that's the
Ah,
transfer tax. That's like when someone buys a new home, how they pay taxes on that. And that can be, that's part of closing costs. It can be quite expensive.
mhm.
And we know that a huge number of really high value homes have changed hands in these last few years, often with cash.
Yeah.
And that drives up sort of values for everyone. And it means that there are resources available. And so we changed the transfer tax to lower it for homes purchased below $750,000. And we increased it for homes purchased over $750,000.
Oh, interesting.
And in doing that, we were able to raise more money to pay for the creation of new housing. Because the property transfer tax has a long history of going to the creation of new housing. And so that was a really that was sort of one of the most direct ways we were like, we're going to make things less expensive for your average Vermonter making a median house purchase and more expensive for folks who can most afford it. And so all of that has been exciting conversations to have. The House has passed sort of all three of those policies. I talked about the corporate tax went to pay for strengthening the judiciary and changing Medicaid to expand it to more folks. So sort of like a steps on a Medicare for all path. In this case, it was for folks over 65 who actually pay more for healthcare after they turn 65 than before they turn 65, which I did not know was a thing, and it's terrible. And so we did all of that. And some of it really hit a wall in the Senate. And a lot of that is because most of those taxes are not available for this next fiscal year. They're available a year out because it takes a while to institute a new tax.
And it takes a while to educate people on the new tax too. You don't just want to do it overnight.
No. But our legislative system, and we have talked about this as like major happy hour theme I'm hitting on here, right? It's on like 1 year, 2 year cycles. We are not planning out a decade, and we don't have an administration that's helping us plan out a decade. And so it's really hard to get people thinking like, we're going to do this thing that's politically iffy, right? New taxes. And we're not going to be able to like hand Vermonters this new thing at the exact same time because it's going to take a little bit. And so that's a really hard part of what we wrestle with when we're doing this work, is the kind of planning we need to do to make a difference. And so I'll stop there.
That is perfect. You got it right on the time nose, Emilie. I'm very proud of you. So folks, hang tight. Emilie and I will be back for the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and I've been speaking with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser about taxes, because they are fascinating, people. We want you to find them fascinating because they can do important things, even when we're like looking at our tax bill and crying. They do important things. We also want to thank Brattleboro Community Television for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with PEG stations around the state. Thank you, BCTV. And Emilie, what do we need to remind people of?
Oh, so nice to be here saying this. The views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, those of the hosts and the guests, respectively, not the station, nor their employers, friends, pets, or allies.
Yay! Well done. Well done.
Thank you. I know we are about to jump into school taxes and property taxes, Olga, but I'm realizing I didn't say a very important thing before the break when we were talking about new taxes.
Oh, okay.
And progressive taxes. So we talked about why we raise taxes, what they're for, what they pay for, why, they improve Vermonters' lives, and how to raise them progressively. What we didn't talk about is how they can actually in and of themselves be used as a tool to reduce income inequality, which has skyrocketed during the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we passed some really important new tax credits. So we passed the child tax credit in Vermont and nationally. We increased our earned income tax credit. We lowered taxes at the bottom as a way of putting more cash in people's pockets. And when we raised taxes at the top, right? Like we know that in the, until the 70s in Vermont, till the 80s in Vermont and all over the country, right? We saw top tax rates at around 50%. And that really that caps essentially like the hoarding of massive wealth, that kind
Mm-hmm.
of tax policy. And so in doing that, we bring people closer to the same page on their economic experience and their power in our country and in our economy.
Mm-hmm.
And in
Mm-hmm.
doing that, we are able to create the kind of communities where like lots of different kinds of folks with lots of different kinds of lives can live on the same street or in the same community, interact with each other. And I think that's the Vermont way.
You know, I'm glad you said that, Emily, and I will just share this story quickly because as someone who grew up in Vermont, it was an aha moment. And this was probably early 2000s. I was working at SIT, and one of my coworkers who did not grow up in Vermont was very excited. She bought her first house with her husband, and it was over by Cotton Mill Hill.
Mm-hmm.
And a few months had gone by, and we're like, "Oh, do you still like your house? Are you getting used to it?" That type of conversation. And she says, "Love my house, love it. I don't know about this mixed income neighborhood thing, though. That's weird. I've never lived in one of those." And I had this moment of, but aren't but aren't they all like that? Because just the communities I had grown up in,
Mm-hmm.
that's what it was like. That was the norm. And I had a real appreciation for it in that moment, getting to grow up in mixed income neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing about Vermont that we do not talk about often enough. And it's true in almost every town in Vermont. And I'd say even in Brattleboro, it's true on almost every street in Brattleboro. It's really incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Uh, and so if folks are out there wondering why is it incredible, I know for me, it's just you're exposed to so many different types of lives and experiences. How
Mm-hmm.
about for you? What do you think is one of the benefits?
I think when you know your neighbors, you know, like where they're coming from and like how to talk to them and what they might need, like on all, you know, like in all directions.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that we have an easier time making decisions as a collective about what our priorities are and, you know, deciding political issues and, you know, chilling with each other's kids.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. Thank
Yeah.
you for bringing that up. So diving back into education taxes, they're always a big deal. This
Mm-hmm.
year, they're going to be a big deal because it does seem like we're going to have some hefty increases. Um, and then, of course, the administration has offered a solution that I don't think is going to go anywhere.
Mm-mm. I'm not going to even call that a solution, Olga.
I believe you called it a payday loan.
I did indeed. Wow. Look at you following my quotes and with other journalists.
Well, because I'll admit I didn't really understand what I think it was the commissioner was outlining. I'm like, this isn't making sense. I don't see how that's going to solve anything. And then you called it a payday loan, and I'm like, oh, okay, I get it now.
Yeah. Oh,
He tried.
I no, and we have a great working relationship. And I very rarely use that kind of terminology or am political like that in committee or even in most of my work here. And it was interesting and frustrating because essentially sort of on December 1st, November 30th of this last year, we found out that school spending was expected to increase in a really, really significant way across Vermont.
Yep.
And that was not something that we had anticipated. And so I have talked, you know, before the break, we talked about what like really strategic fiscal planning looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And this was not that. And part of that is because we have no centralized system for fiscal planning when it comes to education finance. So the way we pay for school taxes, and if folks want to like go way deeper on this, we recorded an episode about this in January, maybe?
On I think at that point it was the 18%.
Yeah,
Yeah,
on finance. Was that January?
I think it was December, but I've got a note to
Okay,
try to
great.
link to it in the show
Okay,
notes.
cool. And so but in Vermont, the way we pay for education is every school district all around the state decides on the budget that they need to meet the needs of their kids. And voters vote on that budget. And then the state raises the taxes necessary to meet that sort of sum total of all of those approved budgets. The process of budgeting sometimes includes sort of what the matched tax projection might be to it, but it's just a projection because we don't know what the sum total of all those budgets will be yet. And every district sort of goes at this process differently. Some see like what's an allowable growth from last year to this year that voters might be comfortable with. Some really focus on what they think the tax rate will be. Some just say like, what do we need to meet the needs of the kids in our district? And that's beautiful in a lot of ways. And it's, you know, participatory democracy, it's budgeting to need, all of those things are like really core values of mine. And it's really, really hard in that context to do the kind of like long range, fiscally responsible strategic planning that we need to do as a state to make sure that our taxes are sustainable for each taxpayer. And so we entered the legislative session saying, oh, wow, we have other revenue that goes into the education fund, but it's down this year because of that sort of like coming out of pandemic era stuff. We knew that it would be down this year coming out of pandemic era stuff. So we actually set money aside in order to apply to this year's tax rates, but not at the scale we were thinking of. And school spending went up for all the reasons that we talked about why spending on everything went up, right? Those like contracts are coming in higher, costs are higher, and needs for kids are higher, right? But sort of that big bubble of spending wasn't something that like grew at sort of a natural rate. It really just like spiked this year. And so what that looks like is we don't have the power sort of at the state level to say like, no, you can't spend that much because we can't raise taxes that much, which is very different from all the rest of our tax rates and spending and all of the rest of the state government functions. And so what that looks like without like a lot of other new taxes being raised and new taxes that would need to be raised quickly, right, for this next year. And I talked before the break about how most progressive taxes really need to be raised like a year or two out of when you're going to use them. So most taxes that can be raised quickly that we might be using to supplement the property tax are things like sugar taxes and sales taxes and like all of those taxes like that you can just sort of like turn on a switch and raise. Those are all more regressive. They hit folks who are poorer harder than even the property tax, right? And so like that's a really hard switch to make and to justify. And so we've been in this really tough spot through the entire legislative session to say like, we know that these property taxes don't feel sustainable. We know they're actually very, very different from school district to school district. So some communities might be seeing a really large increase expected in their property taxes this year, but some communities really aren't because of how they have incorporated their budgets. And the statewide conversation is about this huge spike without the nuance of how this is really different and very community driven. And so that's what we've been sort of wrestling through. It's an incredibly politicized conversation. It's a conversation with no great solution. I don't at all feel good about the idea of property taxes going up that much. And that's really hard because I'm talking about how these other taxes should go up. And so I think people's like image of me as just like a straight up tax lover rather than a lover of progressive taxes is like a little confusing, right? And no one has a good solution. So since the very first, since that December 1st letter came out, I've been talking to folks across the administration regularly, like begging for ideas, problem solving together for ideas, talking to school boards association, talking to superintendents, talking to business managers, talking to the treasurer, like talking to all the people who might have any ideas about any of this in order to find a path forward. And there isn't a good one. There really isn't. And that's really, really hard. And I think a lot of folks would say, and I think the natural response is, okay, so just reduce spending. But we actually don't have the power to do that. And for a district to reduce spending in a way that isn't just sort of like catastrophic for the community of the school and for how they operate and how they deliver these like really core services to kids, that takes a couple of years. That's changing how classes are configured and how contracts are arranged and how special education is delivered in-house rather than outsourced. All kinds of things, like all kinds of the drivers of the really high cost of education in Vermont are not things we can turn around overnight.
Right.
And so we've been starting that process this year, but it's going to take a few years to do it in a way that like kids won't suffer. And I don't think anyone thinks kids have an easy time of it right now.
No, they don't. No, especially the really post-pandemic cohort. Um, so curiosity question, Emilie. We're looking at a potential, the last numbers I saw for the homestead tax, a potential increase of 15.46%, and for non-homestead, an increase of 18.57%. You know, a couple things have happened this year. You know, we had a number of increases around inflation, around healthcare costs, around a lot of costs schools actually couldn't control, but there they were. And then we also had the phase in of the changes to the per pupil spending that we have talked about in previous episodes. And I'm wondering, with they've kind of created a perfect storm of increases. But I'm curious, is this just like the snake that has eaten the mouse and we're watching it in its belly slowly being digested? And in a year or two, those increases will have leveled out? Or are we looking at like permanent increases? I'm kind of wondering like which way it is.
So what it looks like by all signs and signals is we're really looking at like it without significant structural change. We are looking at like a rebasing of costs. Like it's not going to keep on growing at this rate, but this is how much it costs given our current educational system to educate kids. That said, there's a lot of structural changes that are possible. We have not had the kind of strategic leadership from the Agency of Education over the last many years that would lead to cost savings. So like the ability for districts to collaborate with each other in a way to deliver services more efficiently, assistance in best practices on behavior management or curriculum development. All of that is happening on a district by district level rather than at a state level and then sort of like applied to districts. Special ed costs have gone up a huge amount in Vermont, and a lot of that is we are sort of outsourcing special education to really expensive specialized schools. And so there's a lot that can be done sort of preemptively to lower special education costs, but that takes a couple of years. So there's structural change, and we also have just unbelievably small class sizes in Vermont in a lot of schools, not all schools, a lot of schools. And so there's a lot that can be done about that, because especially once you get out of elementary school, it's really just not like best pedagogical practice in addition to best mathematical practice, like fiscal practice to have class sizes that small. So those are all things that we are working to shift, but it's going to take a few years to make that shift.
So given everything we've been talking about with school taxes, what can people expect at least for this fiscal year? You know, do they need to brace? Do they need to?
So I want to be really, really clear. It is very, very different from community to community.
Okay.
Like very different from community to community. There are communities in the state who are seeing their tax rates be absolutely the same as last year. And some of those communities are seeing their school budgets fail because they're hearing the rhetoric about a 20% tax increase.
Interesting.
So it's really important that if anyone is listening to this, that you actually look at what this means in your own town, in your own district. There's also, how do the school taxes and your municipal taxes come together? And most people sort of experience them as a package deal. They're not. And so really understanding that full picture is important too. And we've done a lot of work since the situation began in January to make a dent in this. So we repealed an exemption to the sales tax for cloud-based software. It's like a long time exemption from when the internet was a new shiny thing. And we wanted to make sure we were like, enabling innovation. I think everyone knows how to use the internet now. Everyone's comfortable with it. We don't need a sales tax exemption to like create innovation in that sector.
Mhm.
It's one example. We also put a surcharge on short-term rentals
Okay.
because they have much lower regulatory costs than hotels.
Mhm.
And honestly, throughout this entire education funding crisis, we've had sort of a constant barrage of requests from Vermonters who are concerned about their property taxes, saying like, can you please do something about short-term rentals and second homes
Mhm.
in this context? Like that's where money should be coming from. And so that was where we looked. And that's like it's a quite small percentage increase. And all of what we've heard from the Joint Fiscal Office is it's not enough to create elasticity. So meaning it's not enough to create behavior change. Because if
Mhm.
a price goes up enough, people will change their behavior in relationship to it. This
Mhm.
surcharge is not considered to. We also did some to make sure that we're protecting sort of the most vulnerable taxpayers. And so the property tax credit, we talk about people paying on income.
Mhm.
The property tax credit that's people paying on income is actually on a year delay. And so unless we change the sort of statute related to that, folks are going to get the credit they would be due from last year to apply to this year's property taxes. So that would create like a really significant hardship for a lot of Vermonters. The majority of Vermonters actually who pay property taxes pay them based on income. And so we
Mhm.
shifted that percentage around. And the bill is still in Senate. So it left the House. It's still in Senate Finance. There's a lot more that I think we're planning to do with it this year. And so it's not over until we are gavel out. And so there's still a week more. And we are really doing everything we can to make sure that we are buffering, I guess, protecting Vermonters from this really significant increase in those districts that there is a significant increase. Again, it's not everywhere, but where it is, it's going to be really hard. And we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to prevent it. And there's a lot in the yield bill this year that starts, and other legislation that's passed to start the really like significant work of the structural change that's needed to make our education finance and education delivery system work better than it is right now.
Okay, thank you. So I have some stats for people. And that's why, Emily, if you're wondering why I was looking off camera so much, I just found them. But before I give those to you, qu curiosity question. I'm sorry I don't know the answer to this, but there has been talk about shifting the education tax from a property tax to an income tax, um, which, like you said, our property taxes are can be based on our income if we have income sensitivity. But has that gone anywhere? Is it worth going anywhere?
So a couple summers ago, I co-chaired the task force on the possible implementation of the income-based education
Mm.
tax.
Mhm.
It was called something like that. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like that. And we really um, talked about it. We really talked about it. We really looked at it very closely. The challenge is that the amount that we need to raise is different every single year in Vermont.
Right.
And we don't know what that amount that we're going to need to raise is until like sort of the last minute with the way our entire education funding system is structured. So without changing sort of this basic like local control budget setting process, there's really no way to pay for it based on income, given how our income tax structure works. And
Gotcha.
so the like basic functional implementation of it is where we hit the wall. And it's funny because the
Mm.
issue has come up over and over and over and over again, and and that basic challenge hasn't been solved yet. And so I think
Interesting.
if that basic challenge was solved, like it's a really interesting conversation to have. But without that being solved, we just, we can't do it. We just can't. Even if it is a good idea. I think there are reasons it's a great idea, right? It's more progressive. And there are reasons it's not a great idea. Property is a proxy for wealth in a lot of ways. There are folks, a lot of folks in Vermont who don't show significant income, who do have significant wealth, and their property is a stand-in for that.
Mhm.
I think particularly in an aging state, we have less and less people, fewer and fewer people declaring income,
Mhm.
who might have significant wealth in the form of their property and aren't even paying on a mortgage anymore, right? And so
Mhm.
have more flexibility with their assets on that. And so I think there's a real question of sort of like, are we doing that because we want to capture the very upper end? Is there a better way to capture that upper end and like return it to the education fund? Is it because we want to protect people who are paying, you know, who have the least income? But every time we modeled it out, middle income people and folks who own sort of median properties were not better off. And I
Mhm.
think those are the folks who right now are getting squeezed. And so in
Yeah.
all of the tax conversations we've had, both these conversations around the property taxes for the education fund and all those conversations around the income taxes and the corporate taxes, those are the folks that we're looking at. We do a very good job in Vermont on income taxes for folks who make, say, like less on all taxes, property taxes, income taxes, every sales taxes, even on folks who make like less than, say, $45,000 a year.
Mhm.
You know, we have these great tax credits. Folks below a certain income actually don't pay any property taxes, even at the municipal level.
Mhm.
We really like, you know, we exempt most basic items, food, clothing from the sales tax. And so those folks are very sort of protected, I think, from a lot of our taxes. But the folks in the middle are the ones that are really being squeezed right now. And so it's these
Mhm.
progressive tax policies that we're looking at to make a difference there.
Thank you. So just quickly, folks, Emily mentioned the second home market once about, with taxes and also the short-term rentals. Peter Elwell last week on the show mentioned this statistic, and I just want to share it because it's pretty significant. So we have about 3% of our housing stock is in the short-term rental market, but about 17% of our housing stock is in the second home market. And in which doesn't sound like much across an entire state, but it's not always
It's a
evenly
lot.
distributed.
Mhm.
In Vermont, in Vermont, in Windham County, we have a much higher second home market or larger second home market than maybe other areas in the state might have. So I just wanted to remind folks of that. So Emily, we have a couple minutes left. I don't know that we're going to see you before the end of the
Mm.
session. So what's on your mind right now? What are you sitting with?
I am hoping that with so many big ideas in the mix between now and next week, we can really sort of find our way in the sort of like last mile chaos of the building to like keep our eye on the prize, make sure that the taxes that we do pass are like those that are most progressive. Make sure that we are doing that in ways that will sort of like immediately, return dividends to Vermonters. New housing, reduced healthcare costs, and that like will come out on the other end being proud of the work we do.
Thank you very much. Hey,
Yeah.
Emilie Kornheiser, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee and regular contributor for the Montpelier Happy Hour. It was really good to see you. If folks want
Good to see you.
to learn more about you, where can they go?
Folks can go to emiliekornheiser.org and you'll find links to all of the relevant places that you can be in touch with me. And Saturday morning, we are having our monthly constituent coffee hour at the library at 10:30 for anyone who wants to come to that. It's from 10:30 to 12 at the library, Brooks Memorial. And Olga, when the session's over, I am like so excited to come back on the show weekly again. And so we're going to have such a good time there.
I can't wait.
So if
It'll
folks
be
have
fun.
ideas for new shows, please be in touch.
Yes, you can email them to the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. And of course, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 and rebroadcasted Wednesday mornings. And of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Hey, take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.